Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. My guest on this episode of Writers at Work is Gail Crowther, whose latest book, Dorothy Parker in Hollywood, examines the life of Parker in an unexpected context. Not in New York, where she began a career in journalism, was a founding member of the Algonquin Roundtable, and established her reputation as a poet and all-around acerbic wit, but in Southern California, where she lived for 3 decades. 3 seemingly miserable decades. A writer, researcher, and academic, Dr. Crowther's previous books include 3 Martini Afternoons at the RITZ, a dual biography exploring the social rebellion of Sylvia Plath and Sexton, The Haunted Reader and Sylvia Plath and DEVON, A Year's Turning, co-written with Elizabeth Sigmund. On the surface, Dorothy Parker seems an entirely different type of subject from Plath and Sexton, authors of highly personal and revealing poetry that's anything but glib. But in Dorothy Parker in Hollywood, we see a talented, troubled artist whose gift for satire may have developed as a shield to ward off further unhappiness. There is much to recommend in Dorothy Parker in Hollywood, not the least of which is witnessing Parker in what to readers is an unfamiliar, often glamorous yet unsatisfying setting. I enjoyed Crowther's Parker portrayal, and I'm happy to discuss the book and other matters with her. Gail Crowther, welcome to Writers at Work.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So, as a writer, what drew you to Dorothy Parker?
Well, it was interesting because I just finished writing a book about Sylvia Plath and Sexton, and they were 2 women who were very well documented, had very detailed archives, and it was possible to do quite traditional research for those 2 writers. And I was fascinated by Dorothy Parker, not only because I was a fan of her work, but because she has no paper archive at all. And I thought this is going to be a really unique challenge to write a biography of somebody who actually hasn't got any material left behind.
From Plath and Sexton to Parker seems a shift in your interest as an author, but is it? Do you see them as sharing much in common?
Yeah, I mean, I think they have certain things in common, and I think a theme that I would attach to all of them is probably women who were slightly misunderstood or maybe don't quite have the legacy that they deserve. And so I was quite keen to revisit them and maybe, I guess, make people look at them in a slightly different way. I mean, the first book was very much about Plath and Sexton being rebels for the time that they were living and writing. And Parker very much, again, has been a woman who was at first ahead of her time, and then sadly towards the end of her life, probably seen as some kind of relic who was slightly out of time.
Yeah. Were you always going to focus on the Hollywood years?
Yes, definitely. Because everything that I'd read about Parker, she was quite dismissive about her time with the Algonquin Roundtable, and I found that quite fascinating. That that's possibly what she's most known for. But it was a period of her life that she didn't really attach that much importance to. Although, of course, it helped create her name and her, to a certain extent, her fame. But I felt that her Hollywood years were slightly overlooked. And when I started researching it, I had no idea how many films that she'd worked on, and just how serious and important some of them were too.
It is amazing to when you tell us for the first time that she was there for 30 years.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
on and off for 30 years. Yeah,
Uh,
so,
uh,
just as long really as New York.
yeah. You know, uh, we as writers may not want to admit this, but um, the people who comprise the Algonquin Roundtable uh, are no longer in vogue. Can we agree on that? I mean, I don't know who anybody who's reading those people, with the exception of Parker.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair point. I think some of the legacy of the Algonquin roundtables still there and still in evidence. You know, for example, we have the New Yorker still that
Right.
kind of came out from that time. But in terms of individual authors, I think I would agree with you that Parker is certainly the most prominent
You know,
relic of that time.
whenever I have writers in New York, I either bring them to the White Horse Tavern or to the Algonquin, and I notice that the younger writers have no idea why I'm doing that.
Right. Okay.
Why are we going to this place? And then and then you can describe it a little bit, and then it makes a little bit of sense. But um, fame sure is fleeting.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah. And I think that's something that probably Parker witnessed firsthand with all of her years in Hollywood as well. I think she found that quite a brutal place.
yeah. I'm under the impression that she would have been miserable anywhere, but she seems particularly miserable in Hollywood. Do you agree? Do you agree that happiness was sort of just out of reach?
I think I think like a lot of us, Parker had moments of joy and happiness, and then moments of great trauma and sadness. I think that's probably true of most of us, but perhaps it would be fair to say that her moments of unhappiness outweighed those moments of joy. But they were there, and I did try to highlight them in the book. I mean, certainly when she was first married to Alan Campbell. They had a really happy and fulfilling marriage, and certainly for the short period of time when she became pregnant and was very excited about becoming a mother, which sadly didn't happen. But those were moments of, I think, great joy and excitement in her life. And likewise, when her friends all went from the East Coast to the West, and they were hanging out in the Garden of Allah and having these
Right.
wild parties, and you know, partying until dawn and doing all kinds of ridiculous pranks on each other. I think there were moments of fun, but I
Yeah.
think professionally, she always felt dissatisfied with herself. And that, of course, when you're professionally dissatisfied, I think that can impact on the rest of your life too.
Yeah. This is my interpretation, and don't be afraid to smack me down. But um, I think her joy was always fleeting, and her unhappiness was much deeper than it seemed to the general public. And I think you in your book are very careful about always reminding us that her unhappiness had roots in some serious issues.
Yes, and I think that's really important because I think Parker, because of her reputation, has been this, great wit and somebody who was very funny and could make everybody laugh. I think it was really important to highlight, especially in her younger years in New York when she was in her 20s, she had some pretty horrific things that happened to her. And she also had, some serious mental health issues too. Um, a very traumatic abortion, suicide attempts. And I always felt that she was never really listened to or supported adequately through that time. And that because she was seen as this, this woman who would go out and drink men under the table and always have something witty to say, people got very frustrated when she wasn't doing that, when she wasn't being funny. And you can see that, during the war years and during the Spanish Civil War when she became involved in that. Newspaper editors got really annoyed with her that she, they accused her of, "Oh, just start being funny again, get back to being, the old Dorothy, don't be too
Yeah.
serious." She was actually a really serious woman and who had experienced some pretty traumatic things. And so I do agree with you. I think those things definitely informed how she viewed life.
One thing among many things you do well in this book is you will quote some seemingly glib remark or acerbic uh, statement that she made, but you then show that in fact it does seem to reflect an insecurity on her behalf. that
Mm.
this glib comment about something in general is in fact a reflection of her self-perception.
Yeah, I think so. And I think she was aware of this too, that she quite often used humor as some sort of shield or some sort of defense. And I think possibly that's not uncommon, but I think one of the dangers of her doing it so much was that people took her quite literally and thought that she was this quite, glib woman that perhaps didn't feel things so deeply, when in fact, as we can see, she most certainly did.
Yeah, and there's one horrific scene in the book where, and you point out that her taste in men up prior to Alan was pretty terrible, and
Really terrible.
and uh, this one man is yelling at her and screaming at her in front of everybody, and makes some sort of comment that she was terrible in bed,
Mm.
for
Mhm.
all to hear, for all to hear.
Yeah, yeah,
And what a blow.
yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. And I think that was indicative of the type of men she sometimes got involved with, which of course the onus isn't on Dorothy Parker to explain why she got involved with these men. The onus is on the men to explain why they thought it was okay to treat her so badly.
right. In fact, you document quite well her dreadful history with men, and I'm going to quote you here. You say it was as if her low self-esteem made her feel lucky that any man was interested in her, however appallingly she behaved.
Mm, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's no
And
way.
that's why when I was researching her, I was so delighted when she met Alan Campbell.
Yeah, I do want to talk about Alan with you, but I just want to get back to something you said earlier. I don't want to let it pass regarding the paper trail. Um, Again, I'm going to be quoting you. You say she is the most unreliable narrator regarding her achievements there, mean there being Hollywood. That's quite a stumbling block for an author, isn't it?
I think it is, and it's quite a challenge for me as a feminist as well, because obviously the first thing you want to do is listen to women and believe women and what they have to say. But it became increasingly obvious to me that Parker was not judging her own work fairly. She was not being fair to herself. And, she would say things in interviews such as, I never wrote a film that I was proud of. I never wrote a film that was any good. I mean, she wrote A Star is Born.
Right.
She wrote Smash Up, the story of a woman. She worked with Hitchcock on a film. She was writing really successful and very insightful films. And so I just felt she was being really unfair to herself and to her talent. And so, yeah, so in that sense, I found her an unreliable judge of her own work, definitely.
Yeah, and most of the commentary that we that survive, or the perspective, the perception of her, comes from men. But mostly we have men talking about her, right?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there are some memoirs from women who she knew in Hollywood. So we get memories from people like Sheila Graham, and it tended to be other writers who were in Hollywood at the time. But it is interesting because I did notice that Parker tended to hang out with men more than women, actually.
Yeah, so yeah, that makes sense, and that's where the perception would come from. Um, yeah, yeah. I mean, you make a great point. She did do some really good work in Hollywood, and I'm thinking in particular of 1935. Can you recall some of the work she did in 35? You say, all in all, life was as good as it got for Dorothy Parker about that year.
Yeah, so 35 would have been when she started work on the story for A Star is Born. And she was working on that with her husband, Alan Campbell, and another writer, Robert Carson. And I think this was a particularly good project for her because there had been a couple of attempts at making this film in Hollywood and it had just never got off the ground for a variety of reasons. Um, it just seemed that writers couldn't quite make the story zing in the way that it needed to. And it just worked for Parker. And I do speculate in the book that perhaps it was something to do with the fact that this was a topic that Parker felt very strongly about,
Mm,
the way in which Hollywood, uh, through her eyes, chewed people up and spat them out and destroyed them.
yeah,
And because she felt very unhappy for a lot of the time in Hollywood, I think she was quite pleased to be able to highlight some of the things that she disliked about it. Mostly for her, it was actually the people. I mean, she said the thing that was evil, she used the word evil. The thing that was
yeah,
evil about Hollywood was the people.
yeah.
She
You
didn't
say
like the
that.
palm trees either.
No, no, yeah, the imported palm trees, and
Yes,
although she did have a garden that she liked, I think you convey that. Uh,
yes.
Yeah, and then you give us a very nice picture. You allow us to imagine her sitting in the garden, having at least a few moments of peace. Um,
Mhm.
you say Parker's insecurity about her writing made her possibly one of the worst candidates to be a Hollywood screenwriter. But her grousing isn't that different than what we hear from other novelists and journalists from other parts of the country or overseas. Is it? I mean, is that correct? She's of a kind in saying this is no work for a good writer.
Well, I mean, I guess it depends. How you view writing and where you think the value in writing lies. If you want to be a great novelist, maybe you think screenwriting in Hollywood isn't where you want to be and isn't what you want to do. But what I found really fascinating while I was researching this book was coming to a gradual understanding that being able to write films is a particular skill in itself. And I really realized this when I encountered multiple descriptions of how Scott Fitzgerald wasn't very good at this. So Scott Fitzgerald, a fabulous novelist, fabulous writer, and went out to Hollywood thinking that he would very easily just be able to churn out some film scripts and couldn't, and really struggled out there, and his work wasn't valued out there. And so I think Dorothy Parker was unusual in that she was working across different genres of writing. She was writing verse, she was writing reviews, she was writing plays, she was writing short stories, and she was also writing successful screenplays as well. And I think she doesn't get enough credit for being able
Mm.
to do all of those things very well.
I love the section in which you describe how P.G. Wodehouse found a way to enjoy the perks of the salary and a beautiful home and splendid weather. Do you recall how he did it?
Yeah, I mean, he managed to work very quickly, but kind of eked out the time. So he realized he could do the work very quickly, but the studios thought it would take him a long time. So he made sure it took him a long time and sort of swanned around having a lovely time, getting paid vast amounts of money, and then, went home from there having had a nice holiday in the California sun.
And you also point out that when it went bad, he didn't blame himself; he blamed Hollywood,
Oh, absolutely.
which I
Yeah, I
think
mean,
it's a very healthy perspective, isn't it?
yeah, and possibly one of the reasons why Parker struggled because she just wasn't able to do that. She instantly blamed herself,
Uh,
and thought that the failure was all hers.
this is sort of off point, but I have to ask curiously: has this book been optioned?
Not yet. No, no,
Yeah.
it hasn't.
Could you be enticed to work on it?
Oh, I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think it would make a great film or even a great TV series. But
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah,
we'll see.
yeah, yeah.
And it's interesting because the book kind of picked because obviously there's been uh what the first Dorothy Parker film, Mrs. Parker in the Vicious Circle, I think it was called.
right.
And that film kind of ends round about the time that Parker's going to Hollywood. So,
Yeah.
it's a great
Well,
opportunity to continue the story.
what I like about your writing is that um, let me see if I can say this properly. Um, there's not a lot of academics in your writing. This is not your graduate thesis. This is a breezy, fun read. It's not
Mm,
always fun what's happening to your protagonist, but it's an enjoyable read. And a lot of times in my mind, I could see the environment. Uh,
okay.
and so that's why I asked the question about it being optioned because um, your academic background and the two previous writers you focused on suggest the heavy hand of academics, but it's not at all in this book. I mean, this is I wouldn't call it a beach read, but it there's a lot of fun in this book.
Yeah, and I think that was deliberate. I feel that I'd spent years writing academic papers, and some of my earlier books were much more academic. And when my Plath Sexton book was picked up by Gallery Books, Simon and Schuster, obviously, this is a commercial publisher. And so I realized that I would be writing a commercial book, and very quickly discovered that I much prefer this style of writing than what feels to me a very fixed academic template. And writing, as you say, in a much faster, breezier, less academic way. I feel suits my voice a bit better, really, and I feel much freer, and I have much more fun writing like that too. Even when the subject material can be quite difficult and can be quite upsetting, the actual act of writing, it feels much more. It just feels freer for me to write in that way.
And how long did it take you to make that transition? What did your first draft sound a little bit too academic, or did you sort of catch on to what you needed to do early on?
Surprisingly, it didn't. I mean, I made the switch with Three Martini Afternoons at the Ritz, which was the book about Plath and Sexton. And I think I was just ready. I was just ready for it to actually leap into something where I was able to be a little bit more creative, a little bit more relaxed. But also, I mean, using that academic background, so the books are researched in exactly the same way as if I would be writing an academic piece, but the style of the writing is just very different.
Yeah, I enjoyed the writing very much. In addition to the story, I enjoyed the writing. So let's talk about Alan Campbell. They marry, they form a fruitful professional partnership. What do you make of him?
Well, I really liked him, and every time I kept thinking how lucky they were to have found each other, because, for a long time, I think their marriage was a real joy for both of them. And also, they enjoyed working together, and they worked very well together. And because their personalities were so different, they had strengths in different areas. So, they could prop each other up, in ways that I just think worked very well. He was the organized one. He would do all the typing, and Parker would sit there and come out with, brilliant pieces of dialogue that he would type up, and then would remove all her swearing from things like that, all her cursing. But I kept thinking, in history, I was trying to think of other women who had been lucky enough, because quite often, women get burdened with these terrible marriages that are so destructive for their writing. And he just kept coming back to Alan Parker seemed to me very much like Leonard Woolf, that
Ah,
quiet, supportive role where their existence allows their wives to be as creative as they can possibly be. They do everything in their life to make their wives' creative and professional lives as easy as they can be.
you
And
know,
that's
Gail, you just called him Alan Parker.
How did I? Oh no.
No, but that
That's
is that.
terrible.
No, it's spot on. It is really spot
Yeah.
on.
No, that's terrible. Yeah.
No,
But
no,
yeah.
because
But
he, if we look at the era in which they were together, he was the wife and she
I
was
guess in a way, yeah. I mean, certainly he took on all the domestic role
right.
in the house, which at that time in America, would definitely have been the role of the woman to do. But he did all of the cooking and the cleaning, and he was Dorothy's stylist, and he helped her with her hair and her dresses, and he, yeah. I mean, I think that's a fair thing that you've said,
Yeah,
definitely.
and outside of sitting in front of the typewriter, she was fairly helpless.
She seemed pretty hopeless. I mean, Alan Campbell gives this story about how she would eat raw bacon rather than you didn't even know bacon had to be cooked in order to be eaten. So, and I think that that helplessness was genuine, I think.
Yeah. No, that I can't quite get my arms around him because I think that he is concealing something from us, whether
In
he
what
is
way?
whether he is gay or not gay, or whether he's out or not out. Um, but in your story, we have this woman who's deeply troubled, having difficulty coping, has the capability to work, and here he comes, and
Mm.
uh, and even if I don't know him as well as I would have liked to, which is no fault of the author, is he is uh, by his nature a person who concealed. Um, I quite like him myself.
I really want him, and the moment at which I became very fond of Alan Campbell was when I got access to all of the letters that he wrote to Dorothy when he was stationed in Europe during the Second World War. And he wrote to her nearly every day from Europe. So there are lots and lots of letters, varying lengths. Some of them are typed, some of them are handwritten, where he's given her as much detail as he can about his day-to-day life.
Yeah,
Obviously, he had to be careful because of censors, so he wasn't always able to say where he was or what he was doing.
right.
Um, but his affection and concern and love for Parker came through so strongly in those letters, along with the fact that he himself was a really beautiful writer.
Yeah, and the context of their professional life, if we just look at A Star Is Born for a minute, so you have the story from William Wellman and Robert Carson, and now Parker and Campbell have to come up with a screenplay from this story. Do you know what the division of labor was?
No, it's impossible to know. And it's pretty much impossible to know who wrote which sections. There's just nothing that lets us see how that was divided up. And that's true of pretty much all of her work in Hollywood, including the uncredited film. I mean, we know she worked on many films. We don't even know what they are, but we know that she was working on them. And we do know some of her uncredited films just because she's mentioned them in letters or other people have mentioned in secondary sources that she was working on them. But in terms of the actual With the Star Is Born, who wrote what, I think very often, and you've probably noticed in the book that I speculate this sounds like Dorothy Parker. This
Yes,
sounds like something, a quip
yes,
that she would come out with, which
yes,
of course is me guessing. I don't know for sure, but
yeah,
it's just a Parkerism.
yeah. But she was kind of like the Tom Stoppard of her day, or the Quentin Tarantino, where they would bring her in to write a line of dialogue. Is that and then
Yeah,
of and then you, who's an informed observer, naturally would say, "Oh, that sounds like her."
yeah, I mean, there are lines that are very similar, but then, of course, after I'd been reading all of these letters that Alan Campbell had written, he's also very funny and very sharp. and has, like Parker, a great observational eye. So then I started thinking, well, could be a Campbell line. We just don't know.
Yeah, yeah. So, would you say that she finally figured out what her job was in Hollywood?
I think her answer would be no. But
Ah,
I think that having watched the films that she worked on, I think she was really successful in Hollywood, and she gave herself too much of a hard time about the work she did there.
yeah. Would you say that Hollywood was good for her?
I think it was definitely good for her financially,
Yeah,
and it was one of the few places and one of the few jobs where a woman at that time could earn as much as, or much more than her male counterpart, which was quite rare. And she was earning vast amounts of money.
yeah. And
Yeah,
spending
the equivalent today of $20,000 a week,
yeah, and spending it though,
and
correct?
spending it all. Yes, she
So
was great at spending it.
I guess my question is in terms of her talent. Did she misuse her talent? In the sense that she never did write the great novel that her short stories suggested she could have.
I don't know about misusing. I mean, maybe she just wasn't ever meant to be a novelist. She was very good at, as I said earlier, across lots of different genres, but maybe just novel writing wasn't her thing. And I think because she struggled sometimes to actually sit down and write, and she struggled to have that. It was almost like, I think in an interview she said something about a novel feels like running a marathon, and she felt more of a sprinter, and she just didn't maybe have the longevity of concentration that it would need to write a novel. And I think her particular strength in writing was being able to reproduce dialogue. I mean, she listened to people. She would sit in places and listen to people, and that's why for me, her best short stories are the ones where it's one character almost speaking in a monologue, and the accuracy of how people speak is so spot on in her writing, which is probably why she was so strong when she was writing in Hollywood for films.
Do you think it helped you be able to reassess Parker because you're not American?
It's a good question.
I mean, you're not caught up in some of the mythology because it's not mythology for you, right? I
No,
mean,
well, I guess I see Parker as a very global writer.
uh,
And so the fact that she's American doesn't seem like a barrier to me. I mean, obviously, I don't have the I don't know what you'd call it, the cultural capital of being born and growing up in America. So obviously my perspective from the other side of the Atlantic is probably a little bit different in that sense. Um, I didn't feel that it was a barrier to me understanding her. And I guess as well, because most of my professional life was spent studying and researching Sylvia Plath. So I felt quite, engrossed in American culture in that way. And then moving on to Anne Sexton and then Dorothy Parker. So it's quite interesting that I seem to have always chosen American women to
mm,
write about.
mm.
And I don't know
So
why that is.
no, I would suggest that having a distance from the culture uh, is an advantage.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, it's a great question because I've honestly never really thought about it. And it could be true. Yeah.
So after all the research and writing, do you like Dorothy Parker?
I love Dorothy Parker. I think I would have been terrified to meet her. Um, but I love her, and I love her courage. I love her genius. I love her resilience. And I think she was a very brave woman, and especially towards the end of her life, I think she was incredibly brave, and I admire her for all of those things.
Yeah. I understand you're working on two new books for Simon and Schuster. Can you tell us anything about them, or is it too soon?
It's a little bit too soon for one, but I can tell you about one of them, which and I'm sticking with Britain this well, kind of Britain. So I'm writing a biography of a novel. So I'm moving on from a person. I'm writing a biography of a novel,
Wow.
which is fascinating. And the novel is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier.
Ah.
So I'm going to be looking at the, basically the life of this novel. So I will be hopping over the Atlantic again because I'll be writing about where the novel came from, how it happened, the influences. But then what happened when Rebecca went out into the world at large. And so I'll be looking at the Orson Welles adaptation, which was the first adaptation of the novel. Obviously, Hitchcock in Hollywood. So I'll be back in Hollywood again for that. The plagiarism trial around the novel, and just actually telling the life of the novel, and then speculating why a novel that was published in the late 1930s is still so popular and so prevalent today.
Wow, it sounds fascinating. So, fine.
Excellent. I'm excited.
Just one more question, if you don't mind. Uh, you dedicate Dorothy Parker in Hollywood to George, who died at age
I do.
11. And
I
George
do.
George was your dog. You described George as the best dog in the world. It's the worst, isn't it, when our dog dies?
It's really, really terrible. And there was something particularly difficult about this book in that George died just as I was reaching the final chapter of the book, which was a really horrible chapter to write anyway, because it was, Alan Campbell dies. Dorothy Parker goes back to New York. She has those difficult, horrible years in New York, and then Dorothy dies as well. And it was horrible. It was a very difficult chapter to write. I was in deep grief for George.
Yes,
It was
yes.
very upsetting material that I was dealing with. And then, I write the epilogue, which is also I found quite moving to write, and it was a very upsetting time. Yes, but the book was always um, going to be dedicated to George, just because he was my life companion, and because, of course, Dorothy Parker was very attached to her dogs too, and I thought she would love the idea of a book
Yeah.
about her being dedicated to a dog.
In one of my novels, my character is in deep grief, and people would ask me, "Oh, did you lose a wife, or did you have that kind of tragedy in your life?" And what I never said was, "No, my dog died."
Mm. It
And
really is the worst.
it's the
Mm.
worst. It's the worst.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's end on a happy note. I really love this book, and I highly recommend it. And I think as a writer, you've done one of the most difficult things, which was to move from the formula and form of academic writing to what is a thoroughly enjoyable piece of narrative nonfiction in my mind. It's just wonderfully done.
Oh, well, thank you so much. That's really kind of you.
Yeah. I've been speaking with Gail Crowther, who's Dorothy Parker in Hollywood, adds an essential perspective to the life of its subject. Gail, thanks so much for joining us on Writers at Work.
Thank you.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersatworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.